Afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to another of our lunchtime seminars here at IGDS. As you know, during these sessions we have very interesting, exciting, progressive work that we share with our university community and beyond. I'm Sue-Ann Barrett, a member of the faculty here, and very pleased to introduce Dr. Brendan Thornton. Got that right?
Yes, you did.
Who is an assistant professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina. Dr. Thornton has a PhD in anthropology, and his published book focuses on Pentecostalism and masculinity. The title, Pentecostalism, Masculinity, and the Politics of Spiritual Authority in the Dominican Republic. If I were you, I'd get a copy. It's very interesting. Today, he shares with us Victims of Illicit Desire, Pentecostal Men of God, and the Specter of Sexual Temptation.
Thank you.
Ooh. And of course, as you know, with academics, we have multiple interests, but chief among them for Dr. Thornton, religious identity in the Caribbean, how people mobilize religion for practical purposes, and the intersections of race, class, and gender with religion. Of course, at present, he's here doing exploratory research on spiritual Baptists in Trinidad and Tobago. So I turn the floor over to Dr. Thornton. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you for allowing me to talk to you guys this afternoon. Thank you for those who are in attendance for lending me your ears for a little bit, and hopefully won't put you to sleep. I think I have something interesting to talk about today, and I hope you find it interesting. Afterward, I hope we will have time for comments and questions and whatnot. I'll stick around. I'm in no rush to run off. So today I'm going to be talking about gender and Pentecostal conversion with a specific focus on men in the Dominican Republic. The talk today is an abbreviated version of an article that I worked on for a special issue on religion and gender for Anthropological Quarterly, which I hope will be coming out sooner than later, but you never know with these things. So I'm going to start off with a quote and get straight into it. Look, I would say that women are more sensitive to the call of conversion. Even though, at the beginning, Jesus called 12 disciples, the whole time, women have been more sensitive to the call. A man easily has more than one woman, while the woman is more of the house, más de la casa. Men use drugs more than women. There are many men and women who use drugs, but men use them more. If you go to a comadón, those that are drinking alcohol tend to be men. The man is more of the streets. Women go to the church first and later bring the men. Women have fewer ties. It's not that God sees a difference between women and men. It's just that when God calls, women go faster to the call. End quote. This quote is from a conversation I had with a local pastor in the Dominican Republic in 2009. In it, he makes explicit two common observations familiar to anyone acquainted with Pentecostal charismatic Christianity in Latin America and the Caribbean, to those who study it, no less to those believers themselves. One, that Christian conversion appeals more to women than to men, and two, that men's seemingly intrinsic relationship with the street or public sphere is antithetical to the church in ways that frustrate conversion. Although men do indeed convert, they do so with less frequency than women and encounter more challenging obstacles to remaining in a congregation and to realizing the faith's ideals. The qualitative differences between the conversion experiences of men and women are frequently acknowledged, but less often appreciated fully or fleshed out thoroughly in accounts of Pentecostal culture in the academic literature. Scholars tend to acknowledge gender differences between the sexes without taking seriously the varied challenges those differences pose for male and female congregants respectively, especially failing to note how those differences influence devotional practices, impact born-again identity, and sway overall commitment to the faith. The flourishing of Pentecostalism throughout the global South in recent decades heralds more than a simple shift in spiritual loyalties or mere cosmetic makeover of the religious field as we know it. To be sure, conversion necessitates a reformation of identity that in many ways requires comprehensive transformations of self, whose effects extend far beyond individual religious commitments to entail radical changes across nearly all aspects of a convert's public and private life. Martin Leinhardt has proposed recently that perhaps the most significant contribution of Pentecostal Christianity to processes of social and cultural change lies in the movement's ability to shape gender roles and identities in new ways. Ethnographers are uniquely equipped to uncover the specific contours of such changes and the exact directions those transformations take in local settings through research methods calibrated to the nuances of social intercourse and native meaning making. Pentecostalism's rapid expansion throughout Latin America is arguably the most widespread social movement the region has seen in the past 40 years, and scholars are only now beginning to address its significant cultural effects. That's my provocative statement for the day. My talk today draws on extensive ethnographic research conducted in Villa Altagracia, a largely impoverished municipal home to roughly 84,000 urban and rural residents located 30 kilometers northwest of the capital city, Santo Domingo, in order to contextualize the poetics and politics of gender maintenance and transformation among male Pentecostal converts. In what follows, I outline a portrait of conflicting masculine paradigms that situate male converts between competing and irreconcilable gender ideals, those of the church and those of the street. By locating the effects of this conflict with the gender anxiety men of the streets face when converting, I highlight the ways in which antagonistic cultural forces shape male identity and male subjectivity in the church and find their symbolic expression in popular cultural forms like that of the demon mistress. Slow to materialize have been detailed studies that take seriously the predicament of masculinity occasioned by conversion and the unique struggles men encounter when joining the faith. Despite a wealth of research on how conversion shapes gender roles and relationships in ways that benefit women as women, thus far, the literature concerning gender and conversion in the Pentecostal context has largely ignored the culture's impact on constructions of maleness. This oversight is extra perplexing in light of the fact that congregations themselves regularly make masculinity an explicit subject of discussion and revision. Regularly overlooking gender dynamics as they relate to masculinity obfuscates the meaningful ways in which maleness, no less than femaleness, is a powerful social construct that motivates, disciplines, and confines human possibilities assigned to the universe of sexual difference. The gap in scholarship here is understandable, even if unsatisfactory, as maleness, almost always the unmarked category, stands in for the universal, obscuring the power relationships responsible for making gender differences meaningful to society's members. Recent scholarship on Pentecostal masculinities has attempted to right the ship in this regard by treating conversion as both a gendered and gendering process that affects men and women in demonstrably varied ways. In exploring further the interconnections between gender and conversion, it is necessary to take a closer look at ethnographic data mined from the quotidian negotiations of men and women as gendered subjects, and the strategic practices they deploy in the context of gendered worlds manufactured by asymmetrical relationships of power. At least since Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, scholars have been keen to acknowledge the performative and contingent aspects of gender, a fluid yet contested social category always open to interpretation, revision, and resignification through daily intercourse. We would be wise to keep this contingency in mind when considering in greater detail the complex ways in which Pentecostal religion, no less than any other religion for that matter, shapes gender performance and expectation, together with the wide-ranging and profound ways that gender informs religious experience for the faithful more broadly. For men in urban neighborhoods across the Dominican Republic, Pentecostal conversion requires that they abandon conventional barrio or street masculinity, colloquially referred to as tigaraje, and adopt an alternative masculine ideal rooted in the moral values of respectability. exemplified locally by the notion of seriousness, respectable men of God mobilize substitute gender repertoires that draw on elevated cultural models of the Stoic male breadwinner and the noble disciplined patriarch as catalysts for male prestige and authority. By prohibiting a range of behaviors fundamental to male gender politics and identity in the streets, such as drinking, gambling, fighting, and womanizing, the church promotes a lofty moral alternative to tigaraje, categorized by the values of integrity, temperance, maturity, decorum, and moral fortitude. Notwithstanding its uneven appeal, the Christian alternative to street masculinity is by no means shouldered with absolute certainty. In fact, it is fraught with ambivalence, as born-again Christianity and tigaraje are coupled antithetically, conversion placing one's faith and one's gender identity at probable and perilous odds. An evangelico, by definition, cannot be a tigre, or macho man of the streets, and vice versa. This local truism presents quite the dilemma for the male convert, who, it is believed, must surrender his tigaraje in order to truly serve God. These former macho men are obliged to forsake the familiar modes of male-centered status competition and its attendant values in the streets in exchange for a Christian masculinity centered on the values of the church and nuclear family. The terms of this misalliance follow from Pentecostal Christianity's uncompromising demonization of a predominantly male urban street culture and the strident ubiquity of that culture in urban neighborhoods throughout the country. Obligations of the faithful to abide by the Word of God and to live ascetic lives clash with deep-seated attachments to popular forms of male gender performance that dominate everyday barrio life. The Church's prohibition on premarital sex and the authoritative injunction against acting on sexual desires are especially difficult for men to embrace and are among the more challenging demands of faith that male converts claim to confront. Men in Villa Altagracia often cite this particular rule as the main deterrent to conversion, and likewise, it is named by the converted as one of the primary obstacles to adopting and maintaining a born-again lifestyle. An important feature of barrio masculinity is boasting of one's sexual conquests and prowess, as well as professing one's appeal and success with women. The hypersexuality respected in the streets is debased in the church, where a muted sexuality is both valued and strictly observed. As Christian converts, overt displays of sexuality are reprehensible and forbidden. Any form of sexual relations outside of marriage are considered illicit and are expressly discouraged. Instead, the avowed doctrine of the Church demands a new form of bodily discipline from its members, one meant to set followers apart from their unconverted peers. The faithful learn a reformed habitus incompatible with the familiar modes of being masculine in the street. For example, while the street life is associated with ostentatious self-indulgence, licentiousness, dogged self-reliance, and frivolity, where men are distinguished for their ability to overcome hardship through slyness and cunning, in the church, alternatively, men are expected to humble themselves before God, to depend alone upon faith and the power of the Holy Spirit for prosperity, believing that nothing is possible without the saving grace and divine will of God Almighty. In contrast to the unmitigated freedoms of the street, the church enforces restricted covenants with its members, requiring that they observe a series of ascetic prohibitions in order to be sanctified and to be saved. In this way, Pentecostal identity is distinguished by restraint, discipline, and modesty, behaviors that differ sharply from the freedom and autonomy characteristic of the streets. It has been observed in the academic literature on gender and conversion in Latin America that the prohibitions of the church function to, quote, domesticate men by demonizing behaviors associated with the male prestige complex, tigaraje for instance, and by retraining their attention on the domestic sphere and the material and emotional concerns of the nuclear family, to the ostensible benefit of women. For many male believers, this domestication is experienced as a feminization, inasmuch as their former obligations to the street and their male friends are replaced by a new set of commitments to faith and family, values usually attributed to the prerogatives of women and their presumably inherent connection to the domestic sphere and authority over the home. In my 2016 book, Negotiating Respect, I discussed the ways in which hypermasculine men, such as former gang members, drug dealers, and macho men of the streets, reconcile the conflict between barrio masculinity and Pentecostal Christianity, and show how they mediate the threat conversion poses to the maintenance of their masculine persona. Today, I'm concerned with illustrating several examples of the personal and cultural elaboration of this conflict. That is, how this conflict is expressed in the lives of converts locally, and its role in shaping masculine identity and male subjectivity in the Pentecostal faith community. For Pentecostal men in Villa Altagracia, Ambivalence towards sexual modesty and restraint, combined with the uncertain renunciation of masculine street values, leads to a kind of gender distress. Anxiety stemming from the challenges of reconciling the conflicting gender ideals of the church with those of the street. The expressions of this distress are the result of cognitive dissonance and may be seen in the resentment converts foster with their spouses, the blame they assign to women for their struggles to avoid sin, and, most notably, the menace of nocturnal she-demon attacks that purportedly threaten to lead good men of God astray. Through idioms of resentment, blame, and demonic assault, male converts make explicit the difficulty in assimilating the new gender frameworks advanced by the church and actively work to cope with them. In turn, the all-too-common demonization of women becomes part and parcel of male subjectivity in the faith community and comes to contour the gendered attitudes and behaviors of male believers in remarkably apparent and notably misogynistic ways. What is sometimes lost in speaking to enthusiastic Pentecostal believers, skimming the academic literature on conversion, or taking note of the staggering growth of Pentecostal churches globally, is how incredibly difficult conversion for many people can be. It is not uncommon for men and for women to convert several times before actually settling into the faith and making a lasting or full conversion. With regularity, people convert, leave the church, return to the fold, only to backslide and abandon the faith again and again. This trend is not unique to Dominican barrios, but is a likely characteristic of evangelical churches globally. Conversion can be difficult, especially when it necessitates considerable personal transformation and cognitive upheaval. Undoubtedly, life in the streets as a drug dealer or gangbanger requires a personal makeover considerably more severe than that required of a God-fearing preacher's son. Difficulty adopting a life in the church is a matter of degree. Many young men in Villa Altagracia, for example, live lives of violence and excess and turn to Pentecostal conversion in order to escape gang affiliations, drug addiction, and street crime. Few, if any, of my informants who followed this path would have described their conversions as having been easy or carefree. And nothing I've observed in my research suggests that becoming a Pentecostal is without its myriad trials, or that the values of the church are assimilated quickly or even thoroughly or consistently. Conversion is difficult because it obliges converts, in some cases, to take sizable, perhaps even excruciating strides to transform their lives and assimilate new values and convictions. Adapting to the church's rules can be difficult, even if for many of the converts, vale la pena, or worth it in the end. The conversions of men I refer to here are marked by particularly acute reversals of moral identity. Men like them leave the comparatively permissive and indulgent streets and take up ethically demanding and restrictive lives in the church. The transformation these converts attempt to make is by no means easily achieved. In some cases, they must forsake their former friends, move from their natal homes, procure alternative employment, and create entirely new lives for themselves apart from the streets, the cradle of the cultural values they know best. As a precondition for salvation, converts are forbidden from sinning and are directed to follow a number of rules or prohibitions in order to realize this ideal. Among the many prohibitions the church stipulates are no fighting, no swearing, no dancing, no gambling, no drinking, no patronizing bars or clubs, no street festivals, no smoking, no fraternizing, no stealing, no lying, no infidelity, and no sex outside of marriage. Conversion, for some, requires profound changes in dress, countenance, behavior, language, attitude, outlook, and emotion, many of which are antithetical to the standards of maleness familiar to the streets. Of course, external physical transformations are easier to undertake and quicker to realize than the deeper, more substantial internal changes that require sincere commitment and considerable time to crystallize and become salient for believers. Emotional investments in popular forms of masculinity are not simply suspended upon conversion nor miraculously disappear with an intellectual turn to ascetic religious observance. These transformations take time. Through doctrine classes and the mentorship of seasoned congregants, junior and recent converts get the practical spiritual guidance they need to supplement the divine inspiration understood to have been the impetus for their call to the faith. Rarely, in Villa Altagracia, do those new to the faith complain about not being able to drink or smoke, curse, or carry on as they once did in their pre-conversion lives. These former behaviors are typically overcome with little embellishment, or at least no difficulty to which they make explicit reference. male converts rarely report rules against drinking, swearing, or fighting as taxing or hard to comply with. To the contrary, conquering such vices is a point of pride and prestige and figures as an important measure of a convert's charismatic new identity, as free of sin and necessarily transformed and redeemed. However, the prohibition on sexual matters, such as fornication, womanizing, explicit or aggressive sexuality, and other so-called desires of the flesh, inspire a range of responses that indicate not a little bit of ambivalence. Quote, giving up women, as it is often construed, is cited by young unmarried men that I spoke with as far and away the most challenging requirement of Pentecostal faith. Consider this young musician's assessment of the church's rules and the challenges confronting his own conversion. Quote, the most difficult thing to avoid here are the women. The women are a problem. They're a serious issue for me. Wherever I go to play music or something, women always approach me. They offer themselves to me. They make themselves available to me. But in the end, you should avoid these things. It only suits the body. It is a desire of the flesh, not the spirit. This is the most difficult thing for me, I swear. If this did not exist, I would be the best Christian in the world, really. End quote. On the one hand, it is relatively easy to avoid the sin of intemperance by eschewing alcohol and steering clear of bars and nightclubs. Similarly, if one only wishes, it's a fairly simple task to stop cursing, fighting, smoking, or breaking the law. On the other hand, illicit sexual desires are of a different order of sin altogether and are much more difficult to manage. One need not do anything to have lustful and therefore illicit thoughts about a neighbor. Simply thinking or having such thoughts is deemed sinful and reprehensible. Desire is itself an abstract idea, difficult to grasp conceptually, but easily felt nevertheless. To dispense with sexual desire is in some ways akin to ignoring an hungry, empty stomach. One can deny it, but at what expense to his or her own comfort? Furthermore, unlike other sins that one can cease committing entirely, for example, eliminating violence or drinking from one's life altogether, sexuality is disciplined by the faith, but not completely forbidden or eliminated. The church delineates permissible and impermissible sexual expression, sanctioning sexual contact for married couples alone. Converts are not asked to extinguish sexual desire entirely, only to regulate it, to parse the acceptable from the unacceptable, and to demonstrate mastery over temptation. The converts that I came to know struggled with those demands of the church that require a unique kind of self-restraint and impulse management. In this case, those that require the suppression of sexual desire and resisting the social pressures to chase and involve oneself sexually with women. Sexual temptation is feared to be a great threat to young male converts who are taught to regard lustful thoughts as sinful, and therefore the providence of the devil. If left unchecked, prohibited desires can keep the faithful from achieving holiness and thwart their bid for salvation. For these young men, illicit desires are a thorny obstacle to achieving sanctity and the salvation of their soul. Thus, from their perspective, and by dubious implication, therefore so are women. Suspect coquettes are reviled for their blasphemous manipulation of impressionable men, scorned for their culpability in distracting them from spiritual pursuits, and perhaps most damning of all, derided for consorting with the devil. By way of a peculiar, if predictable kind of logic, one that finds inspiration and scriptural support in the Bible itself, women, the objects of male desire and the focus of sexual temptation in the barrio, are frequently cast by the faithful as adversaries to good Christian men, seductresses used by the devil to lead man of God from the path of righteousness and salvation. Quote, "It's not the drugs, but the women," explains one young convert who had just left the street life. "The devil uses them to persuade you to fall and leave the church. But once you leave the church, the women leave." End quote. Likewise, for Radames, a 17-year-old ex-gang member who converted to the church in 2009, women are unscrupulous and not to be trusted. Quote, "There are many Delilahs, many women who say that I am ahentao, that I think that I'm somebody now that I'm in the church. They look to take advantage of you. They look for a way to knock you down from grace. This is so that you get a false sense of pride and do not see things as they really are. But the Word of God says that one must see things as they really are. These same Delilahs are the women who come into my thoughts, in my head, and tell me I can have a woman secretly so that the congregation doesn't find out. End quote. The characters Eve and Delilah are popular female antagonists from the Bible who are invoked in reference to allegedly deceitful women whom male converts perceive to be threatening their spiritual objectives. Delilah, a treacherous and cunning femme fatale, is known for having betrayed Samson and notorious for having led him to his downfall. Church leaders instruct neophytes to be wary of, quote, Delilahs, not just outside the church, but within it as well. Since converting, Radames tries only to spend time with born-again Christians, but even of these women, he remains suspicious and guarded. He says, quote, since converting, I mostly interact with women from the church, but not all of them. There are many who are part of the church, but who are really Delilahs, because they only want to persuade you to fall from grace and to take you from the church. They begin to love you. There was this one who was sending me love letters. Getting the letters was pleasing to me. But one day, I said to her, look, I cannot accept this. And she said to me, but why? I'm from the church too. In truth, she is still attached to worldly things. What they want is to take you away. They say things to you until you fall and leave the church. After that, they never spend time with you again. End quote. For those converts who are married or cohabit with domestic partners, conversion can spur new antagonisms as husbands struggle to assimilate revised expectations of married life put forth by the church and adjust to their new responsibilities as Christian spouses. Now expected to invest significantly more time, resources, and attention into wife and children than ever before, the new accountability demanded of the faithful can be perceived as a weighty burden, especially alongside the other accommodations converts are expected to make almost immediately upon joining the church. In response, some men develop strained relationships with their wives following conversion, in some cases even maligning their spouse's religious devotion and seeking a way out of their marriage commitments with them. In the full article, I give some examples of this, especially of men who refuse to marry their common law wives despite the expectations and encouragement of the faith. I also discuss several ways in which men criticize their wives as hindrances to their spiritual growth. At the same time, they blame women familiars for their own difficulties in meeting the church's ideals. Despite their most sincere efforts, men in the barrios of Villa Altagracia struggle to accommodate the transformative demands of the church and the ubiquitous masculine values of the street that seem always to pull them in the opposite direction. The situation is further complicated by the social and economic situation of converts who are often incapable of financially supporting families of their own or exemplifying the rules of Christian husband as provider, dependable patriarch, and moral exemplar. This is commonly the case for men who have children from multiple unions and are therefore fettered with competing obligations to various women. This might include, for example, potentially conflicting commitments to a wife and her children, possibly to the mother or mothers of his other children, as well as responsibilities to his natal home and also to his male friends and extended family. With moral and financial obligations in so many directions and the ethical imperatives of the church obliging men to satisfy them all, it should come as no surprise that male converts often find themselves drowning in responsibilities they cannot possibly fulfill and failing to manage the expectations that they do not truly believe they can meet. Although conversion resolves some of these conflicts by prioritizing a focus on the needs of the nuclear family over those of, say, one's male friends, or perhaps one's mistress or mistresses, it does not solve the larger issue of divergent commitments outside the home that burden men with responsibilities that make it difficult to accomplish the Christian ideals set forth for husbands and fathers. Men may come to resent women to whom they have strong moral commitments, the mothers of their children, for instance, because they fault them for their struggle to attain these ideals, coming to view them as troublesome obstacles to achieving the prized rewards of the faith and meeting its masculine ideal. In Villa Altagracia, ostensibly obstructive wives are likened implicitly to the devil himself. By allegedly hindering their husband's spiritual potential and impeding his wish to be closer to God, these married women are in effect accused of performing the malevolent role of Christian adversary. Indeed, the very same role played by the devil in Christian dramas of salvation, where the adversary himself is the primary force responsible for keeping man from God and frustrating his attempts at redemption. Through expressions of resentment, no less blame, married converts in the barrio do more than just convey their discontent with the marriage pact. They negate their wives' assertions of moral and spiritual superiority and negotiate space to exercise male autonomy and domestic authority more freely, in no small part by equating women with the illicit spiritual power of el enemigo, the local term for Satan, the enemy of God, meanwhile associating themselves with the virtue of el bueno and divine communion with Jesus Christ. Perhaps most strikingly, the demonization of women in the church takes its most literal and arresting form in the specter of sexual temptation itself and the menace of nocturnal she-demon attacks that threaten to spoil the holiness of converted men. For both married and unmarried converts alike, the specter of sexual temptation is perhaps the most conspicuous expression of the gender distress attending conversion from the street life and the most explicit symbol of their struggle against illicit desire. At this end of the spectrum, converts come to experience their conversions quite literally as predatory assaults on their manhood. In these instances, sexual desire takes the form of a demon mistress, whom Dominican Pentecostals call a matresa, who comes into the mind of a man and forces him to have sex with her. The term matresa refers to a female division of local spirits, variously known as misterios, santos, or seres by their servants, that have its roots in the highly syncretic Catholic, African, and Haitian-inspired spirit pantheon of Dominican Vodou. The term has been appropriated by Pentecostals who associate this class of spirits with perverse sexuality and malevolent femininity, loose women, prostitutes, and witches, commonly casting the lot of them as demon seductresses who prey on impressionable men and who torment vulnerable women through demonic possession. Believed to be among the devil's most treacherous minions, sent to thwart the salvation of man, they are said to be spirit entities that enter the thoughts of the converted, who are unweary in their pious discipline, or who may have succumbed, however briefly, to the temptation of illicit desire. For believers in Villa Altagracia, the war with the devil is described as a mental war over contrasting moral values, a battle between good and evil in which the faithful are most vulnerable at night, when malevolent spirits come to assail their sleeping victims on account of their daylight transgressions. Several of my informants explained that, quote, the battleground of Christians is the mind, and that the spiritual war is a mental war. It is believed that one's thoughts open a door from which the devil may enter and reveal himself. Men must therefore fortify themselves spiritually and mentally through prayer, congregating in a church, some even choosing to sleep there, and fasting, striving always to be vigilant in the face of pervasive depravity and the devil's manipulative designs. The flesh, they say, is weak and ever subject to demonic manipulation. If you spend the day lusting after women, the devil will turn your sinful thoughts against you in the form of evil spirits who have sexual intercourse with sleeping men. The specific mechanics of these assaults become clear in Radames's interpretation of a masturbatory experience in the church one night where he slept. Several of my informants slept in the church as a vow to God after their conversions. He says, quote, when I began to sleep in the church, there was a matresa that visited me. These are Delilahs that take hold of the mind. There are times that you're thinking you're having sex, and you wake up wet and sweaty. Jose Luis saw me one day and said that he had seen the matresa that was pursuing me. He said, I saw the matresa that was doing all of that to you. They use you and your hands. I woke up with the zipper of my pants open, with everything unbuttoned, but it was the matresa that had unbuttoned it for me. The demon used me without me realizing. End quote. In this retelling of a personal encounter with a native succubus, Radames casts himself as a sympathetic victim, powerless to oppose the unsolicited sexual advance of the demon mistress. Blaming the matresa for using his own hands to commit the illicit act, Radames denies culpability for the midnight affair by locating blame not with himself, but with the treacherous she-demon, who as a wicked external agent seized upon his forbidden desires and maliciously used them against him. The vulnerability he expresses in this account is suggestive of the powerlessness men are believed to exhibit in controlling their own desires. The she-demon attacks, symptomatic of the moral torment typically macho men experience upon joining the church. Here, and more broadly in the Dominican Republic, men are charitably viewed as incorrigible flirts, who are regularly, if begrudgingly, pardoned for moral lapses attributable to their insatiable attraction to women. The assaults themselves are a powerful inversion of dominant sexual imagery in Dominican society. The demon mistress, or so-called matresa, subjects her male victim to a passive sexual role, where distressingly he becomes a supine and submissive recipient rather than a dominant active initiator of the coital act, in essence feminizing him for sex. The encounters can be interpreted thus as performing a kind of symbolic undoing of male sexual prerogatives in a manner analogous to the harm inflicted upon the masculine ego by the ascetic prohibitions of the church that feminize male converts through the renunciation of masculine street values and by seemingly requiring men to submit to a range of feminine interests, including, presumably, obliging them to acquiesce to their wife's authority at home. The portrayal of aggressive female sexuality is an inverted Dominican social ideal, one that reflects the feminizing experience of conversion for reformed men of the streets, and the loss of barrio masculinity for those once rewarded, now punished, for their impressive drive to sex. The denial of virility is, of course, profoundly conflicting for male converts. A principal vector in the dominant configurations of masculinity in the streets, unchecked virility, if not refuted by the faithful, offends their fidelity to the church, threatening any hope of salvation. Their trying efforts to evade prohibited desires and to realize spiritual perfection are expressed in vivid detail in his encounter to elude the instantiation of dangerous, forbidden sexuality in the form of a demon mistress. The encounters themselves delineate a trenchant local phenomenology of guilt and forbidden desire as experienced by male churchgoers and read through a gendered moral framework figured by Pentecostalism's ascetic Christian message and expressed in the idiom of demonic assault. The appearances of these lascivious beings are, with little doubt, corollaries of the deeply ambivalent acceptance of the church's prohibition on sex and the unique experience of being male and Christian in the barrio churches. The demonic encounters, therefore, reveal themselves to be at least metaphorically true, if not empirically so, for some leading to a more or less literal assault on their manhood. These sinful erotic encounters are hardly unique to the Dominican Republic. They have an obvious historical precedent in the early Christian church, where erotic thoughts were held to be demon-inspired, and eliminating them often took the shape of a dramatic battle against seductive demonic spirits. According to Charles Stewart, early Christian ascetics, not unlike the Pentecostal men discussed here, sought to eliminate erotic dreams as part of their quest for spiritual perfection. Facing the threat of a potentially feminizing conversion and the guilt of their own intractable desires, male converts translate their distress into a spiritual battle for salvation. Not exactly against their own deep-seated conflictual desires or moral failures, but against concrete objects of culturally legitimate, socially acceptable scorn and public antipathy. That is, of course, treacherous, seductive women. In the most extreme cases, men animate their illicit desires in the form of unwelcome demonic assaults, the personal threat of forbidden desire becoming the personified threat of erotic sin in the form of alluring succubi. As a particularly punitive result of this dynamic, one that openly defies female probity and moral authority in the church, women, in the eyes of anxious, beguiled male converts, are transformed into demonic temptresses, or Delilahs, encumbering troublesome wives, Eves, and the embodiment of temptation and illicit desire itself, she-demons that believers call matresas. These, what I.M. Lewis might have called sex war aspects of conversion, are revelatory instances of the sexual tensions characteristic of Pentecostal gender relations in the barrio and the novel gender politics of the evangelical faith that frame male conversion and religious behavior locally. While the church attempts to resolve domestic strife in the contentious husband-wife relation by consolidating mutual commitment to the nuclear family and dissolving men's antagonistic commitment to the street and extramarital affairs, it simultaneously creates new antagonisms based on the strong persecution of normative masculine values and the imposition of a nearly unattainable Christian ideal of manhood. This is remarkably so for impoverished barrio residents who neither have the financial resources nor the cultural capital to embody the much vaunted values of respectability esteemed by the country's elite and affirmed by the church's doctrine of holiness. It should be noted that believers themselves do not associate the difficulty of assimilating Pentecostal gender norms with the demands of the church, its prohibitions, or the faith itself. but instead attribute their struggles to the putative presence of the demonic and the intractable spirit of male sexuality. In this way, male converts transpose their frustrations with conversion requirements, and by extension necessarily the church itself, to objects of more appropriate scorn, like the cultural symbols of dangerous sexual aggression, such as prostitution and loose women, along with so-called metresas, the devious temptresses who embody the perceived dangers of unbridled sexual power. The victims of malevolent spirit attacks in the form of native succubi tend to be men who grapple with the demands of the church and who likely have the most to lose if they backslide and return to their former lives in the streets. Concern about Radames in particular was frequently expressed by fellow churchgoers who were concerned about his commitment to the faith and his long-term prospects for remaining with the congregation after having left a notably brutal street gang and having been observed laboring to abide by the rules of the church. They pointed to his seeming inability to completely relinquish las cosas del mundo, or the so-called desires of the flesh forbidden to believers, and wholly embrace his new life in Jesus Christ. Encounters with metresas, along with treacherous women, are sometimes blamed for backsliding men and the difficult adjustments to church life that male converts commonly face. I propose, however, that these examples are more profitably read not as the stimulus preventing men in the barrio from being good Christians, as is sometimes claimed by believers themselves, but rather as the evocative result of their attempts to be good Christians and the anxiety of adopting new gendered modes of being required to do so successfully. Stories of seductive Delilahs, obstructive wives, and devious succubi dramatize the difficulty male converts face in managing and overcoming their will to sex and properly assuming the reformed gender expectations of the church that are compulsory for their achieving sanctity, for achieving sanctity. These varied demonic encounters, along with their accompanying testimonies, are a product of male believers' attempts to live virtuously in accordance with the gospel, despite the tremendous pressure to transform their lives within a cultural environment, the urban barrio, that rewards men authority and prestige in terms profoundly incongruous with the church and its mission. As rhetorical genres, the testimonies of this nature illustrate the challenges of living a born-again lifestyle in urban poverty and the difficulties former men of the street face in achieving and preserving holiness. Not at all incidentally, women, to my knowledge, are rarely, if ever, the victims of incubi, male demons who have sexual intercourse with sleeping women. If they are, I never heard such stories, and they cannot be said to feature regularly, if at all prominently, in popular Pentecostal discourse or demonology in Villa Altagracia. Here, to be seduced sexually by demonic spirits is something that apparently only victimizes men. Something psychoanalytically informed observers will note is a particularly convenient compromise formation, an inappropriate, if unconscious, wish revealing itself as its opposite in the form of a terrifying nightmare. This may be indicative of the stress peculiar to exceptionally macho men and the crucial role played by conflicting gender norms in shaping new male identities in the church. In any case, women are no strangers to the demonic idiom in their own right. Usually possessed, and this inhabited or controlled by demonic spirits more often than men, women around the world have been observed to utilize the demonic idiom as a way of negotiating their own gendered interests. And this is a reference to broader literature on spirit possession, cross-culturally. Occasions of blame, resentment, and demonic assault are not simply expressive evocations of gender distress or simple manifestations of sexual frustration and anxiety attending conversion from the street life, but as such, they are also transformative idioms that, through their occasioning, inform male identity and subjectivity in the church as much as they influence the perceptions of gender within the broader faith community. It can be affirmed that the renunciation of sexual desire represents an important site of ambitious moral self-making, especially for devoted male converts, a decisive cog in the constitution of gendered church subjects. It might also be claimed that by fostering new antagonisms with women, based expressly on their newfound piety, men fashion gendered spiritual identities emphatically apart from and in opposition to women. Their sizable efforts at moral transformation, to define themselves anew as reformed, saintly servants of Christ, are facilitated by the active observance of ascetic prohibitions and the antagonistic relationships that they inspire. not unlike the spirit possession idiom interpreted by folks like Vincent Crapinzano and others as vernacular tools for communicating a certain range of experience, it seems likely that the demonic idioms figured here provide male converts a way of articulating or construing their experience of gender distress, at once rendering it meaningfully concrete and therefore manageable by providing a basis for directed action and an anchor for purposive redress. By realizing their inner conflict as demon-inspired and aided by women, Pentecostal men make sense of their conversion anxieties, creating in them dramatic contests of spiritual fidelity, conceived in terms of a moral struggle between God and the devil, good and evil, pious man and immoral woman, enabling them to tackle enigmatic sin head-on in order to manage it, defeat it, perhaps ultimately to resolve it. Evocative instances of demonic assault articulate the experience of being male and manly in the church and enunciate the struggle encountered by the penitent to remain faithful amidst sin and sexual temptation. In describing these encounters and in eliciting their regular occurrence, the convert, qua victim, draws attention to himself and his plight as a male servant of Christ and the trials that forge him as an enviable, devout man of God. A repentant, reformed sinner turned saint from the wicked barrio streets, who by the grace of the Almighty defeats illicit sin by literally conquering his own demons through impressive spiritual discipline. Penitent macho men replace conquering sexual partners with conquering sexual desires as the primary mode of their reformed virility. To be an honorable man of the church, un hombre de Dios, necessarily means to struggle with one's own demons of reform and to declare eventual victory over them through divine grace and ascetic discipline. Pious and principled, the victorious are esteemed as vigilant champions of the faith, spiritual victors who by conquering evil have established themselves as models of Christian manhood. Described by the faithful as virtuous, disciplined, trustworthy, and respectable, el hombre serio, the quintessential man of God, is simultaneously victor and victim, the height of his accomplishments only as spectacular as the depths reached by the failures he has overcome, his spiritual triumph matched only by the extent of his victimhood reversed. Thank you. I appreciate your ears.